We are all living through a phenomenal digital revolution. Advances in technology and data acquisition and artificial intelligence have impacted just about every corner of our lives, not just here in the US, but around the globe to some 7 billion people. And many of these things are wonderful. There are really many tremendous things about democratization of access to information and to technology and bringing the world closer in communication. But as with every innovation, there are dark sides. And as a young, budding computer scientist, we shouldn't ignore those. We should pay attention to the ethical issues and the potential harm that can come from technologies that we ourselves are developing. And that's what this lecture is about today by way of a case study. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about ethical issues around artificial intelligence and data. And the work I'm going to be describing is that of Julia Dressa. Julia was a student with me at Dartmouth College. She graduated in 2017. And the work I'm going to be describing was her senior thesis work. And this work all started around this issue of the use of AI to make recommendations. Now, you have all almost certainly been subjected to a recommendation that looks something like this. If you liked X, then you may like Y. Netflix, Amazon, Spotify, recommendations that look at the patterns of movies you watch, products you buy, music that you listen to, look at what other people have done with those same patterns and make recommendations. Yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Either way, it's fine. I mean, they're just recommendations for watching movies. Now, you may have also been subjected to a recommendation engine that looks something like this. If you are like X, then we may accept you. Companies, in some cases universities, are using automatic algorithms to review your applications and make determinations as to whether you should be interviewed or granted a job. Here the stakes are, of course, getting a little bit higher now because we are talking about your potential employment and educational prospects. Maybe you have not already because you're all young, but many of us have been subjected to predictions that look like this. If you are like X, then we may give you a loan. Banks, financial institutions routinely look at your credit history, your history in financial transactions, compares that to other people, looks to see what the default rates are, and make recommendations. Do you get a mortgage? Do you get a small business loan? Stakes are getting a little bit higher now. This is now your financial well-being as well. And more over the last few years, people have been subjected to the following type of prediction. If you are like X, then we may put you in jail. Courts now around the country are routinely using predictive algorithms to determine whether you are at risk of committing a crime, whether you are being released on probation, whether you're being considered for bail. And now the stakes are getting very high, which is now it is your very liberty that is at stake for these prediction algorithms. And it is these types of algorithms in particular that we're going to talk about today. Now, in 2016, ProPublica wrote a really impactful piece. And if you have not seen this, I'm going to encourage you to search for this piece called Machine Bias. There's software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it is biased against blacks. It was a phenomenal body of reporting that pointed to some very troubling patterns in a software that was being used in the courts of law to make predictions about whether somebody is at risk of committing a crime in the future and whether that person should be granted bail or not. So let me talk a little bit about what this article found, and I'm going to tell you a little bit then about what Julia and I worked on for the following year to try to really understand what's happening with this type of machine bias. So what ProPublica found is that one particular software produced what's called the recidivism risk score. This essentially takes as input some information about you, how many times you've been committed a crime before, how many times you've been arrested, how much time you served in jail, your employment history, your age, your gender, and a long list of things that you might have information about somebody. And it produced a score. And that score was, what is your risk of committing a crime in the next 2 years? And then that could be used, and in fact was being used by the courts to make a judgment as to whether you were at risk for recidivating and whether they should grant you bail. And what ProPublica found is that the mistakes that this algorithm made, and it's okay, we understand that these things are not perfect, but the nature of the mistakes were very problematic. So I'm going to talk about two types of mistakes. The first one is a false positive, which says I'm going to predict that you recidivate, but you in fact don't. So I'm going to classify you as high risk, but in fact you are not high risk at all. Okay? And what they found is that if you were black, then you were 44.9% of the times you were predicted to recidivate when you didn't. But if you were white, that was only about half of that, 23.5%. That is a huge difference across the races. So that is, black people were being falsely accused of being high risk when in fact they were not, at a rate twice that of white people. Now, that's not the only type of mistakes that the algorithm makes. It also can make a false negative, which is that you are predicted not to recidivate, but in fact you do. So I say, you know what, this person's not high risk, but it turns out they go out and they commit a crime. So let's look at the error rate for these false negatives for across races. If you were black, that error only happened 28% of the time, but if you were white, it happened 47.7% of the time, exactly the opposite. So in the previous false positive, blacks were at about a factor of 2 disadvantage of saying they were high risk when they weren't. And not only that, but in this mistakes, white are being advantaged by saying that they are not high risk when they are. So obviously this is deeply troubling. This is not obviously fair. And we need to understand this. If we're going to use these types of AI algorithms, we need to understand where is this coming from and what can we do about it. So shortly after this article appeared, Julia came to me and said, we have to do something about this. We are technologists, we are mathematicians, we are computer scientists. We have to fix this. We have to build a better prediction algorithm. And I agreed with her. And we set out over the next year and a half or so to try to do that. And as we were doing that, a question came up. We were sitting in my office one day, and one of us asked the question is, well, you know, we keep trying to come up with algorithms that are better than humans, but do we actually know how good humans are at this task? I mean, just baseline. I mean, if you're trying to build an algorithm that deals with potential bias in the criminal justice system, shouldn't we ask how well humans are? And of course the answer is yes. And so we went out and looked at the literature, and in fact we couldn't find anybody who would assess what the baseline is. So what are these algorithms being compared against? How do you know whether an algorithm is improving the state of the art if you don't know how well humans are performing? And so that's what we set out to do at the very beginning, is just ask a really simple question. Is the AI, these algorithms, any better than you and me and potential people who are making these decisions? And then we want to understand what is the nature of that racial bias that we saw, and then can we fix it? So we're going to start by answering this, and then we're going to get to those other questions. All right, I'm going to stop right here, and we'll pick it up in a little bit and start getting at this question right here. I'll see you in a few minutes.